The seminary has always taught people how to sing. You can't be an Orthodox Christian without singing or listening to singing. The hymnography of the church, the liturgy of the church uh, is expressed in music, in song. The seminary has also always taught not necessarily how to paint icons, but how to understand icons and the architecture of the church. And in the past few years, the seminary has inaugurated an Institute of Sacred Arts that kind of institutionalizes this very teaching. We continue to teach people how to sing. We continue to teach people how to understand icons, but we also are reflecting in a very concerted way as to how the arts are infused with theology. The arts are expressing theology, and how theology, the development of theology, is always permeated by the arts. One can't think of understanding the scriptures without thinking of how the scriptures themselves are encased in beautiful metal or sometimes stone embellished encasings. One can't think about the liturgical life of the church without thinking of iconography or of architecture, the space within which one is engaging the worship of the church. And so theology is always creative and artistic, and the creative and artistic life of the church is always theological. And that's really what the Institute of Sacred Arts is about exploring. What it does, the Institute has a curricular dimension, right? So our over the past several years, our courses in the arts have been growing. They've been enriched largely through the coming of one of our colleagues speaking today, Dr. Rossitza Schroeder, art historian. We're also teaching courses in liturgy and the arts. We are teaching courses in musicology and composition and theology. This semester, I'm teaching a course in religious themes in film. In other words, the arts that we consider are not always liturgical arts. They're also extra liturgical arts. Such also is our engagement with the composer Arvo Pärt, with whose center our seminary has a concordat relationship. We also sponsor public events, lectures, panel discussions. We had a fascinating panel discussion not that long ago featuring Andrew Gould, Jonathan Pajot, and Aidan Hart, moderated by Rossitza Schroeder and myself. We are involved in the cultural landscape outside the church as well. This past year at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there was a very high profile, very well-reviewed exhibit on Africa and Byzantium. And our own student, Jamie Rawl, one of our students who is engaged in the concentration on sacred arts in her studies at St. Vladimir's, was one of the few interns for that exhibit. So she kind of gave of her knowledge of the Orthodox Church into the preparation of that massive exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She also led an exclusive tour on a day when the museum was closed to the general public. She led a tour for some of our friends and supporters of that exhibit, which was absolutely unforgettable. We also are involved in concerts. We have been assisting the concerts and work of the world-renowned choral ensemble Capella Romana, directed by Alexander Lingus, our most recent faculty member now in the Sacred Arts Institute. There's more to say on our publications, on our podcast called Luminous Conversations on Sacred Arts. There are now 60 episodes of conversations with people of all different entries into the world of the arts and into the spiritual, the world of the sacred. Again, I could say a lot more, but this is part of what your support, your prayerful and financial and otherwise intellectual support of the seminary is helping. I was asked to mention some of our incentives. What is a fundraiser without a tote bag? I don't even want to know what a fundraiser is without a tote bag. We've got tote bags. We have, gosh, what are our other incentives? We have the tote. We have a absolutely wonderful new mug that has just been designed. It highlights all of our different endeavors. This is the seminary in general. This is our new online School of Theology, a smash success, inaugurated just this past year, about which I'll say more in the next hour. St. Vladimir Seminary Press. And then if you're a right-handed person, what greets you as you raise your mug to your mouth is the Institute of Sacred Arts logo. Okay, so we have that. We have a wonderful new CD called Arise, the music of the Psalms, sung by our own choral ensemble, as well as a one of the most recent publications of the seminary press by our alumna, Sister Anastasia, called You Are Mine. So all of these are incentives. And in the chat window now, my colleague Sarah has posted the various amounts for which these are rewards. And in the next hour, I'll tell you how you can get this incredible mug, which actually is a very magical mug because it disappears when you move it away from your body, and then it reappears when you bring it close to your body. I mean, St. Vladimir's, it's amazing. All right, with this, I introduce my, I keep saying cherished colleagues because that's what they are. Dr. Rossitza Schroeder is an associate professor of art history at the seminary. She has her doctorate in art history and archaeology from the University of Maryland. She has published on the relationship between monastic practice and monumental church art in late Byzantium, as well as on Byzantine, Venetian, Ottoman connections, as reflected in the portrait of the conqueror of Constantinople, Mehmet II, by the Venetian artist Gentile Bellini. She is an amazing colleague, my associate director of the Institute, and we are in frequent contact, and we don't see enough of each other. She lives in Janeville, Wisconsin. Dr. Ani Shahinian, one of my newest colleagues, maybe my newest colleagues, is teaching at St. Nersess Armenian Seminary, with whom St. Vladimir's has for decades had a sister seminary relationship, much to our blessing. She is assistant professor in Armenian Christian art and theology. She holds a post in Grace and Paul Shahinian lectureship at the seminary. She earned her doctorate in history and theology at Oxford. She also has an MA in Near Eastern Languages and Culture from UCLA, diplomas in theology and philosophy from Oxford. Her doctoral research addressed the question of Christian martyrdom in the context of political, socioeconomic, and ecclesiastical history in late medieval Armenia. She's teaching a course for us, in fact, this academic year on the lives of the martyrs. More broadly, Dr. Shahinian's research interests address questions of what it means to be human in a technological age, focusing on virtue ethics and the freedom of the human will. So there's even a little bit of dovetailing with our previous session. And so the title of this next hour's conversation is called Byzantine and Armenian Christian Art and Beyond. So happy you are with us, my friends. Take it away.
Thank you for having us, Peter. Thank you, everyone who is joining. I will allow myself to share my screen because given that we're going to talk about art, there is no way of not showing some pictures. So I'm going to do this. All right. And I wanted to start with an image that Dr. Shahinian and I agreed on, an image that is probably familiar to a lot of you. And this is the 6th century encaustic icon of Christ, which is now on Mount Sinai. I did write on top of my slide, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And Ani and I were talking, what does that really mean? Ani, what do you think? How would you comment on this in relation to the image that we are looking on the screen?
Thank you, Rossitza, and thank you so much, Peter, for that wonderful introduction. I think, it's so interesting that something such a cliche that we've heard so often, that a picture can speak 1,000 words, really holds a certain truth. What do we really mean by a statement like that? It really is captivating the attention first, and really comes to this idea of really capturing one's attention, not only in an image, but here in even a word, to say, is this really a true? So that first question becomes, what do we mean, and is this really true? And when I look at this image here, it's fascinating to me, the contrast. And immediately I'm wanting to understand what the person painting it had in mind. So whether it speaks 1,000 words or not, or whether it speaks 1,000,000 words for that matter, I look at that and there is something that captivates my imagination. Something that perhaps I would take 1,000 or 1,000,000 words to try to describe, I can actually meditatively reflect.
Yes, indeed. Actually, there are hundreds of pages written on this icon. And I gave away actually the next point of our conversation, but I wanted to stick to it for a second. There's a lot of things have been said about an image which that you're looking here at on the screen, and clearly what we are trying to say here is that an image can speak or can have a content that is worth 1,000 plus words. In our society, I think we're so used to pictures, even icons, that we basically pass them over. Oh, that's Christ. And then we move on. But I think that it's worth stopping and, as Ani points out, looking, our attention being captivated by and meditating on it and seeing what the image or the icon of Christ actually does to us and to our imagination. What are we thinking about? And of course, what was the person who was painting this thinking about? And maybe we will be able to kind of look into the question of what it means to paint an icon in both in the past as well as in this day and age. But before that, you may notice here that Christ, this is a 6th century icon, painted in a technique which was used in the Roman Empire way before the Christians, and which has been preserved on portraits of dead people. And they actually used the same kind of techniques and everything to paint their icons, the early Christians, that is. And you can clearly see that something is going on in that picture that immediately attracts your attention. And that's the fact that Christ's face is so distinctly asymmetrical. One side is dark. His eye is slightly kind of is smaller. His eyebrow is arched a little bit more. The other side is bright. His eye is widely open, and he seems to be a little bit more, how to say, benevolent. And we have to pay attention to it. What is the artist trying to tell us? Does it have to do something with divinity and humanity? And then the question arises, can we really represent divinity, or can we just simply imply it? Or does it have something to do with the fact that Christ is both judgmental or he judges as well as he loves? And perhaps this is what we're looking at. Do we really have to fix on single meaning? Is that necessary? Would that make the image less effective because it actually tries to convey more than an individual or single point? My question is, no, we don't have to really kind of sit with one individual answer. What do you think, Ani?
Sorry, I had muted myself. I do absolutely think what you're saying comes to really the question of tension. It doesn't necessarily put us in a place where we come away with it and resolve with one response, so to speak. It does allow us to enter and view something like this beautiful illustration, which has survived time in many ways too. Really, this is a big question about how do we interpret something, an image here, with the tools of today that speaks to today's mind as it did back in the medieval times. So the tension allows for even the mind today, the modern mind, to enter in and really be able to engage with what the tensions are. And this goes back to a point I made earlier about the contrasts, which I think is really interesting, both, if I may say, illustratively here, but also theologically.
Yes.
And you made the great point about the asymmetrical representation, which often it's also said about the very word about God in the scripture, whether Christ as represented throughout Old Testament and New Testament, how that is actually comes into the conversation of, are we really talking about the same God? And here we are, even in an art like this, you can actually go into that sort of question. So I think it's interesting that we can actually spend the entire hour right now talking about this, and yet it goes back to this main, cliche, if we want to say it, that a picture does speak many words to the heart, to the mind, and also to the different cultures. This isn't necessarily coming out of the Armenian culture, right? This illustration. And yet it speaks to various world and illustrations.
What's really interesting, my teacher, when I went to SMU to do my master's degree, and she's Christian, she's actually a Quaker. And she has told me personally how she has been in the presence of this icon on Mount Sinai. And it completely rendered her speechless. Speaking exactly, I'm kind of trying to confirm your observation that it can speak, this particular icon clearly, even though it's produced in the 6th century, can speak across time and space, even to individuals, to people whose mindset is not necessarily at all how attracted to this particular kind of to visual representations in the context of worship or in the context of church, because probably, as a lot of people know, Quaker churches are distinct with their kind of lack of imagery, and as well as in the silence, kind of the silent presence of the people who are present there. And this is something totally different. And she did have a visceral reaction to the picture when she saw it. And I think that there is something here that speaks to the power of icons to really address not simply the mind, but the human viscera, the human soul, which resides probably somewhere here where I'm pointing right now at my chest, right here. And it is here that I just wanted to switch to the next image and to the next slide rather, and to discuss a little bit what really is an icon and how do the Byzantines in this case, because I'm a Byzantine art historian, and the Armenians thought of as icons. And I'm sure a lot of people know that really the main formulations of what an icon is and how we relate to icons come from the area of the time of iconoclasm. When icons were removed from churches, the church fathers of the Seventh Ecumenical Council kind of got together and put in the arguments for the necessity of icons within the church. And perhaps the best argument that is made, and which stems primarily from the work of St. John of Damascus, is that if Christ was incarnate, it meant that he became visible, which means that he could be represented. So if there is incarnation, there is representation. My favorite thing to do here is to reverse that statement according to the rules of logic, which means you negate both sides when you reverse it. When you do that, what do we have? If there is no representation, there is no incarnation. In that respect, we see that in a way, the representation, i.e. the icon, becomes in a way a proof and a necessity for the belief in the enfleshment of God into Jesus Christ. And
If you,
yeah,
Rossitza, if you were to think about for the modern mind, because I think, icons, when I first came to the study of it, I think it's so helpful just to understand what is an icon to begin with. I mean, besides the religious connotation, icon has a particular meaning.
yes.
And even for my modern audience, if I'm talking about not a medieval painting or an illustration, icon has it's the pathway for communicating something.
Yes.
It's so almost, if we can think of it as a vessel. So what is that? I mean, I'd be very curious to hear it from you. I have some thoughts that I've been sort of thinking about, but I really wanted to know, how would you describe that before we can actually take it to the medieval world, or even to some of the illustrations that have been given to us from the Christian world, to say, certainly Christ becoming man, a human and being enfleshed, the incarnation, can be represented.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that sort of first, how would we actually understand the idea or the concept of icon before we can say it is the incarnation can be, in a sense, in an iconographical way represented?
I would say that in the present day, perhaps a lot of people perceive the icon as a holy image. It's a visual representation of the holy. It could be a holy person, or it could be a biblical narrative from the life of a saint, or something to that effect. It has the icon is a material carrier. It's a visual aspect of a story that's being told in a like, say, for example, in the Bible, as we see here in one of the images, that is the Armenian one. Mm-hmm. Icons are the visual representations that aid Christians in their relationship to the holy. And I do agree, actually, with the fathers, with John Chrysostom and St. Theodore the Studite, that we do not worship the icons. We worship through the icons, and with them, the person who is represented on the icons. And also, in a way, icons are a testimony, almost a historical testimony that this person had existed, that they have a prototype, and the prototype is a living person in a particular time and space that has been given to us in order for us to be able to relate to that person or to that event. What do you think?
Yeah. I've had several discussions with people from various worldviews and backgrounds, whether immediately having that reverence for an icon, or someone who might think, oh, it's actually not assisting me in any way because I don't know how to actually understand it. An entry point I was thinking of was something like, even when I look at an icon on my laptop, desktop, and it says it's an icon. And I thought, what does that mean for my modern mind? And really, the best way I thought to describe it, and I'm sort of processing out loud here and would very much care about what you have to think about this, is it really represents something that is known. So it's immediately recognizable. I don't have to look at this icon to my left here and think, who is that really? The first time I saw it, I had never seen it before. And it actually, the reason why it was an icon wasn't because I knew the word icon. It was because it immediately reminds you of the person of Christ.
Yes.
So again, when I see an icon on my desktop of a folder or some sort of an icon of something, I'm not standing there and sort of assessing, do I really know what this is?
That's a very good point.
So it becomes, and in Armenian Christian art and in Armenian Christian theological thought, an icon in many ways is not only a representation of that very person or event, it also becomes an entryway where it once
Yes.
if we look to the very right of the slide, what I see is, immediately it might require some sort of a background for a person to understand what a dove represents, for example.
Yep.
But and also it might require a little bit of an engagement with religious language, perhaps. But if I'm looking at this without any of that background, it allows an entryway for me to start to think, what is it? And again, here we have Armenian scripts on the illumination, which would certainly, this is where the word or the text and the image together become a very powerful communicative venue. And it brings the imagination of the human person not to only absorb the text in the black and white, but then the sort of the contrast that we see in the image to bring about language otherwise that could be lost on us. So that's kind of where I thought I went with some of the people who are asking questions about, but I don't understand. Like, if I'm looking at some sort of painting or illustration from history, what is an icon is lost on me, because how would I even begin to look at that? So giving some sort of that, modern implication to say how an entryway to some interpretation of the art is possible, I thought it was very helpful for discussion.
And also another word of caution. I have, before I came to St. Vlad's, actually, I was teaching in a Protestant seminary. And one of the fascinating aspects of my encounter with my Protestant students was that they could not understand the difference between veneration of icons and idol venerations. For them, icon and idol pretty much collapsed. So actually teasing this out for them has been very essential. And the other thing that is very important, icons are not ornaments. They're not decoration. They're much more than that. A lot of, again, amongst the Protestants, the adornment of the Byzantine Church, in this case, of the Armenian Church, of the Orthodox Church, with icons is almost nonsensical. They feel that this is kind of a frivolous way of using resources on, by having mosaics and beautiful, all kinds of beautiful materials that come in the church. And it has been, I have found it a very, I personally found it challenging to really kind of respond to the question of the importance of icons, exactly because they're capable of conveying much more than the simple or ornamental value that some people assign to them. They are, and there is this famous saying that it's been quoted, from the Middle Ages, and it says something like, the icons for the poor and the unlettered are what the books are for those who can read. It's what's really interesting about this statement. It's not that the poor are stupid and they have to look at icons because they can't read. No, the point here is that letters or the book and the icon have a similar content, and they can convey exactly the same ideas in a way that is pertinent to the to words on one hand and images on the other. So images again are worth 1,000 words. They can convey quite a lot when you look at them. And here we were talking about languages, and one of the interesting thing about icons, and especially about their visual appearance, is that there could be varied languages for the holy. This is an example of it. On one hand, you have a Byzantine Christ, which some of you probably recognize. This is from a 13th century mosaic in Hagia Sophia in one of the galleries. And then on another hand, you have the representation here of Christ with two donors in an Armenian manuscript. You look at this, and you realize that one really kind of looks Armenian. And those of you who go to Armenian churches, like Ani, would say, oh, that's Armenian. Those of us who go to Bulgarian, like me, some Russian occasionally, but primarily Greek churches, would recognize this Christ as kind of Byzantine / Greek. can you comment a little bit more? I know that you were interested in these kind of juxtapositions, Ani.
Yeah, absolutely. So the manuscript is actually from 14th century, one of the famous painters, Sarkis Pițac, a painter illustrator in the Cilician Kingdom that was very flourishing and artist. And if anyone's interested in that, they can find a bit more on him and his works. Many of them are beautifully illustrated. I think it's very powerful statement to say that when I actually was personally in Hagia Sophia and I saw that, and I thought for the first time, it spoke to me in volumes of, oh, this feels very familiar to me. This feels very familiar to my world and my context. Indeed, certainly some differences in how an Armenian iconographer or an Armenian theologian would interpret even the shapes of the cross, for example, or the scripture or the illuminations on the book, and some of the colors of the clothing. That becomes something to really explore in difference, and even the posturing of the hand of Christ. These become all areas of perhaps contrast, but certainly speaking to the triune nature of the Godhead is really represented in both images, as we see, in a way that speaks to the beholder in multiple layers, whether they have the language, the actual words to express it or not. So
Anyway,
the language of art, the language of Christian sacred art, the language of religious art, holds together a sort of a very unique grammatical nature, if I want to put this way, of how one can actually engage with it as we carry various of the elements of that in us as a soul, as a spirit. And not to make a very major distinction between those two words of soul and spirit, but to really speak of what it means. Again, this goes back to the very essence of one of my very interested questions, is what it means to be a person, what it means to be human. So this exposes, it almost becomes a sort of a reflective mirror. As I look, there's something in me that can engage with it.
Yes.
Perhaps even if we go as far as to say the divinity that is in me engages with not only what's there on the page, but also perhaps even the divinity of the person who illustrated it there. And then so that it comes together across time and space. So we are not divided by, and this is true when I read the words, but it's also true here as I am able to behold the image that has been transmitted over the course of hundreds, and if not in some of this case, 1,000 years. So it's not that the image only speaks 1,000 words, but it speaks across a period of 1,000 years.
That's very true. That's actually perhaps one of the characteristics of sacred art, that by being kind of perhaps set aside in order to honor the holy, it becomes in a way a language, as you point out, a way to speak with the holy across space, but also across time. Thus, those of us who live in the 21st century can still look at 13th or 14th century icons and feel the power of these images, and kind of what do I want to say? And internalize actually a relationship with them. And another thing that I think is very important in general about sacred art, because we are ultimately talking here exactly about sacred art, is that the paradigms that underlie it, the patterns that are behind it, the prototypes, as the Byzantine calls them, are so big, so capacious, that they allow for the language to be slightly different. Thus, the Armenians do Armenian looking Christ. The Byzantines do Byzantine looking Christ. I actually was a few days ago, well, yesterday, actually came back from Cleveland, when I went to see the African Byzantium exhibition that Dr. Peter Butenov mentioned, in which I was looking at completely Ethiopian, Coptic, and Nubian Christs. Some of them who looked very different from actually what we're looking here on the screen. And yet there was something there that spoke to me as an Orthodox Christian, as a person who had seen these images over and over again. So there is both something specific, but there is also something universal about the kind of language, visual language that we see in the kinds of images that we're looking at here. And as we were talking about the varied languages for the sacred, there is also varied architectures. And I couldn't help but show, of course, the exterior of Hagia Sophia, which is familiar probably to a lot of people, who is famous for its kind of cascading, rounded domes that actually now stand as almost as a paradigm, as the prototype, these kind of rounded domes for a lot of other churches that we see even in our landscapes today. And then right next to it is actually a very famous Armenian church. And can you tell us a little bit more about it? It's the Akhtamar.
Yeah, absolutely. There is one word also I want us to sort of expand for our listeners too, this idea of holy and sacred. So we have this interpretation of the idea of icons, which I think is very helpful for me to have that expanding of the terminology. But holy and sacred, as we talk about the church structure, the architecture for the Armenians, this is very important idea of how, in a sense, the entire meaning of scriptures come together, even in the idea how they put the dome together. So starting from Genesis of creation to crucifixion, all of that is incorporated in the architectural structure of the church. Even the idea of the cruciform church, even the idea of the posturing of the human soul before the very idea of the dome having that 8-day creation idea. And if you think of both domes here, in the Akhtamar, you could see, I believe this is the west side of the church, and you can count 3 windows on the top. There's 8 of them total, representing each one as a day of creation, with the 8th day being the new creation. So this idea that everything is very intentional. Yes. Everything, even sort of the sculpture reliefs around the church that tell the story in many ways iconographically. Why? Because as soon as you look at that, there's no question whether this is a scene of Abraham, preparing to sacrifice Isaac, or it's the crucifixion. Every section of the church really, in a beautiful iconographical language of the arts, speaks the story, the narrative of what it was for Christ to come through all of the various stages of human time and the unfolding of his incarnation, entry into salvation, for salvation history. So here on the right, the history of Akhtamar is one that actually it's the other side of modern day Turkey. So we have Istanbul on our left, and then we have Lake Van, which is the very east of Turkey today, to the right. It tells the story of roughly, I want to say, 1,100 years of history. Akhtamar was first started back in 900s by King Gagik, at the time governing the area of Lake Van. And it speaks the volumes. Yes, here you could see actually on the left side, if you're looking to the right of the slide, on the left you have King Gagik sort of erecting this church on his hands as the sponsor of Akhtamar church. And then also looking at the relief on the very right of it is Christ, represented with the sort of the entryway of the angelic beings on the very bottom. So this reliefs are all throughout. It's a very unique church, also even in Armenian architecture. If any of our listeners are interested in a bit more detail about this particular church, The Saint Nersess Armenian Seminary site on YouTube has an entire 11 sessions of Armenian church architecture course taught by Dr. Roberta and I last term at the seminary, and it goes into more detail, not only about these reliefs, but general study of the Armenian church architecture. So I will leave it at that. But also at some point would love to go back to this idea of how we understand the holy and sacred as a language for how we speak about church and our positioning with being centered in that. As I walk into a place that we claim to be holy and sacred, what do we mean by that? Do we then mean everything else is not holy? Or so what are we really saying? I think this is a very important discussion that I would very much enjoy having with you, Rossitza.
Oh, I know, Annie, you would enjoy, because in our preliminary conversation, actually, I was completely cut and dry. Church is holy, everything outside isn't. Of course, that's it's very easy to be that binary and to be that kind of, say yes and no. What I want to say is that the church really, as you're pointing, Annie, is built in order to really set apart a space for, in this case, worshiping and relating to the holy in a special and in a particularly special way. That's why the church, as you're pointing out, is so symbolically charged as a space. The dome is the heavens, the narthex is the earth, the naos, again, is kind of some space between the heavens and the earth. I mean, it is hardly coincidental that the Russians, when they went to Hagia Sophia, before they had turned into Orthodox Christians, the Russian envoys, they exclaimed, "We did not know whether we are on heaven or on earth." And it makes perfect sense. I do think that church transforms the church building, the actual physical church building. I'm not talking the church as a community, simply as a community. The actual church building transforms everything and everyone who enters. We become partakers in the body of Christ when we commune. The priest actually is the representation of Christ. You are under the heavenly dome where Christ is looking down at you. And every other material also, as I would show like in a second, every other material also is turned into something else, and it's activated in a particular symbolic way that makes us participants, not simply in the liturgy, but in the grand, big, endless, and timeless story of salvation. And one thing that is really interesting, and that some scholars have talked about Byzantine architecture, that at some point, actually, one particular type of church building, not Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is unmatched in the Byzantine history. Only the Ottomans, the Turks, actually, who recognized that this is a sacred space and didn't wait. They turn it into a mosque. Before 3 days after they entered the city, they started building their mosques to imitate this space, which indicates, that for them, this was just a mind-blowing transformational structure. But there is another type of church called cross in square. Basically, there is a cross that's incorporated in a square with a little dome on top that became literally, and I'm going to use the word very, very poignantly, iconic. It means it was repeated over and over and over again. Even when you did not have the materials to build a church like that, they would go out of their way to actually find them, finding columns or just carving columns when you don't need columns, for example, in cave churches. In that respect, we're looking here at something that really, exactly because it's sacred, because it provides that connection to the holy that allows it to become repetitive in a unique way. And that's why even today, these are two churches in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm sure you can guess which is now the Armenian and which is the Greek / that has Byzantine sources. And it comes to show how iconic these particular architectural elements have become and have been translated over time in a way, completely transcending time and space. And we did bring this for a second before that, when Annie was talking about the sponsor of Actamar. But one thing that characterizes sacred art is not only its varied visual languages, but also varied visual mediums. Armenians actually, as you can see here, probably not always, but would utilize sculpture, like a relief. There is relief in Byzantium, but this is not something that really the Byzantines excelled at or were really interested in. What we associated with the Greek, with the Byzantine, is the fresco and the mosaic. And that's, again, there's this, it does not make the images less sacred. They make them a little bit more culturally specific, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, I think that's well said, Rossitza.
And just one thing that I love showing, because I can't help it. So what happens with the material that is incorporated into the church building? Is this simply a decorative element? And we're looking here at the very simple worn-off floor of Hagia Sophia before it was covered with the prayer carpets. As far as I know, I haven't seen it since it was turned into a mosque. And I do this because I want to point out to you is that when you look carefully at the ways in which the light rakes onto this wavy surface of the marble, again, very simple. They could have put mosaics if they wanted to. Justinian seemed to have had limitless resources when he had this building built. He put that marble. Why? Because in the context of the church, as the light is being organized in a particular way and choreographed, it hits the floor and turns the stone into what clearly looks like water. What does that do to the people who enter here? They actually walk on water. How many people walk on water? Just think about the biblical narrative immediately, kind of that recalls immediately. It's Peter once when he believed, and of course Christ, which again, what does this do to you? It makes you into another Peter. It makes you even into another Christ. And the material in the church is really harnessed. The potential of that material is harnessed in order to make you, again, not an observer, a participant. It makes you into a partaker, into a story that seems to have stretched historically from the past into the present. That's what church buildings do, and that's why you ought to know this kind of stuff. Matter matters, and that's actually one of the greatest contributions, I think, of Orthodox in general. The ways in which we discuss matter is something that's meaningful, and also something that we have to discard because our spirit is the only thing we have to really deal with.
And the very essence of walking here on these stones as walking on water, it activates the person's memory or even the idea of recalling faith, have faith. So as soon as I enter into the presence of God or the presence of the holy, it is a question of faith. So I that's a beautiful illustration. I really think that powerfully comes together. And I know there are questions and answers session at some point, and I'm mindful of the time.
Yes.
And I know we have a couple more areas we'd like to touch, but I will let Peter kind of guide us on this.
Oh, if you have more areas to touch, please have at it. I just, I'm so blown away by this most recent observation about the water and walking on water. I mean, you've blown us away with this observation, but it's part and parcel of what the two of you have been talking about the whole hour. And that is not only that icons are teachers, both of the literate and the illiterate, but that there's a visceral effect such that church art changes the person counters it. And sometimes it's a conscious thing. It's like, oh, look at me. It looks like I'm walking on water. But sometimes it's absolutely beyond the the conscious rational mind, and it has an effect that is beyond words. So a picture not only tells 1,000 words, a picture goes beyond words, and somehow hits us in a more enduring place of our being. And so if you have some more things to say, and perhaps some inquiries to answer, but I'm sure you'll be bearing in mind this visceral effect that the arts have on us.
Mm.
Well, that's one of the reasons, actually, Peter, you kind of so nicely transitioned to the last slide that I have prepared. And this is what we call praying with icons. What does it mean to stand before an icon? Are you going to pray to an icon of Virgin Mary in this case, or in this case of Saint Nicholas, or Christ with the same words? How are you going to address the icon or the person who is represented of the icon in the icon? And is the icon provide us information, or does it form us in a particular way? One of the things that I've been kind of I have studied Byzantine art for so long, 20-something years. And only since I started studying teaching at St. Vladimir's, I realized that what icons sometimes do, they put us in a position in which we have to assume a particular type of personality. It has nothing to do with being schizophrenic. It has something to do with actually being in the proper relationship with the person who is represented to the icon, on the icon. And there's this delightful story that one Byzantine author tells about a priest who is praying to an icon of Virgin Mary, and he addresses her, he says, with the words of Archangel Gabriel. And I thought to myself, what is that? Oh, what he was doing. She was there, and he was actually recreating what? The Annunciation. He was calling Hail Mary. He was actually being in the guise of Gabriel, even though his name was not Gabriel. Of course, you're not going to say that to Christ. It's a different kind of relationship that Christ requires from you. You would become another type of person. From the biblical narrative, from other sacred stories, that would make you more appropriate, in your relationship with Christ. And what's really fascinating, there is a little blue book that Father Maximus Constas translated with beautiful Byzantine prayers to Virgin Mary. And one of the people, who prays to her says that I will praise you with the words of the Archangel. And that's what you do. The icons do not simply inform you about the person, they actually form you. They put you literally in your place.
The icons in this way are reproducing what the hymnography does.
Yes, absolutely.
At least in Eastern Orthodox theology, I don't know about the Armenian, in almost every festal hymn, it begins today.
Yes.
Today, he who hung the earth upon the waters is hung upon the tree. Today, he who, whether it's nativity, resurrection, presentation into the temple, it's always today. And this is something that George Cordis, I can't believe I forgot to mention him in my introduction. We have a close relationship with George Cordis and his writing The Light School of Iconography. He emphasizes this very much too, as the icon's role is, I like the way you put it, Rossitza, putting us in our place. It doesn't act like a time machine bringing us back 2,000 years. It brings 2,000 years right here today into the eternal now, if I can. I wonder if you stopped screen sharing and brought the icons of our faces back into full
Excellent point.
prominence as I invite you with any sort of closing thoughts or words. I so much appreciate how dialogical and conversational this hour has been. I should also add, by the way, the amount of people listening right now is an all-time high. That's how much, this session matters to people. Thanks be to God. Yeah, really, we have just a couple more minutes, please.
I know there was a discussion between Rossitza and I about the repetition and the patterns of art that is so important for us to really have that awareness, again, attention. Always comes back to this idea of what is in us as human beings that becomes important in the expression, and art as an expression, icons as a way for us to engage and find our connection to the divine. And for me, I think if I can just close with that thought, and I know I want to honor some of the questions that have been asked, is the very uniqueness of us as human beings in the image and likeness of God to be able to enter into the process of repetition throughout, whether it is the brushstrokes of art, or whether it is the ability to create chain and connection through words to bring about meaning. Ultimately, it's this idea of what it means to be in the divine image, this idea of an image of meaning that comes through this process of repetition, as we observe even in color, even in the contrast and exchange of color, that when I'm embracing an image, standing before it, it mirrors certain things. And that's very well said by Rossitza, it is actually beholding us in a way. And that takes me into various thoughts about modern implications, which I'd like to potentially leave it for a future discussion. Maybe all the participants who are interested in how art today continues to be a vessel or a venue for really engaging the depths of the human person, even in a technological age, remains something for exploration. So for the purposes of time, I think I will leave that with that. But I think it's very important to understand or reflect or have that attention to the patterns and repetitions of art.
Yes, to be repetitive doesn't mean that you will be the repetitive nature of some of the icons it's not limiting. It's actually, there's something else there, because as I mentioned, the pattern is so big and so capacious that it's the repetition is worth it. And I would leave it with the question, can you imagine AI painting an icon?
And the idea of AI, I think it's a fascinating tool to really understand the repetition within. Yes. And to understand that even the reflection of the divine in us to even represent or present something of the repetition in an AI to create that. And I think it's a beautiful discussion to be had in our modern world about art and AI. And AI is able to put quite a bit out there representing that which we already encompass in us. So it's not something beyond us in that sense. So what does it mean to really bring all of that together? And I think that's an important discussion for sacred arts particularly.